It happens automatically. We don't even know that we're doing it. Hello, my name's Jimmy. What's yours? Oh, and what do you do? The moment we meet people, we begin ranking them, looking at the way they dress or speak or what they do to decide how important they are, how interested in them we should be. And we all know what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked. We see their eyes start to drift, looking for someone more important to speak to. Their answers shorten, yeah. And as soon as there's a break in the conversation, they excuse themselves and walk away. So what is a good life, a worthy life? What sort of people should we be interested in, should we honor? And what should we strive to be like ourselves? That's our topic today. The disciples ask the question in verse 1. Matthew 18 and verse 1, they say, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" They're sure that Jesus will know the answer. After all, he was the greatest and most glorious and worthy human being to ever walk the earth, teaching with stunning insight and relevant, healing disease and turning back natural disaster. And yet he has a surprising plan. He's just stated it again in chapter 17 and verse 22. He said, the Son of Man, that's Jesus, is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. Why would someone so powerful do something so humiliating? The disciples can't get it. Their interest is in other things. Verse 1, they ask, chapter 18 and verse 1, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? They can't get it. And so Jesus patiently convenes another lesson in Kingdom 101, his fourth extended teaching session in Matthew's Gospel. And his subject is not glory, but humble service, life on the way to the cross. The disciples, like us, want to know what they could do to earn God's favor, to live a worthy life. But Jesus' answer is shocking. Look with me at verse 2. Verse 2 says, Jesus called a little child to them and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. We miss out on the shock of these words because our culture honors youth and despises old age. But the world in which Jesus spoke honored age and experience and wisdom. And children were seen as foolish, with little to offer, and so they were pushed aside. And to that world, Jesus says that the way to heaven is to be like this despised child. Today he might have made a similar point by bringing in a homeless beggar. Imagine that, someone roughly dressed, reeking of smoke and urine, not even making eye contact. And now here Jesus saying, unless you change and become like this homeless person, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. It is a shocking thing to say, but what does he mean by it? Well, he's not saying that children are somehow innocent or morally pure, deserving of heaven. What they are is humble and willing to receive and not have to earn to deserve gifts. Think of this little child. He had no right to stand next to Jesus among the great apostles. He hadn't given up his fishing boat and nets to follow Jesus, or heard his teaching, or taken part in his miracles. He had no right to be there. And yet there he was. Why? Not because of anything he'd done, but because Jesus called him and he trusted Jesus. And that is the way to heaven, the only way. Jesus says in verse 4, whoever takes the lowly position, the humble position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He wants us to be clear. Heaven, life in his kingdom, is not a reward for a worthy life. It's a gift for undeserving children. If we could earn our way to heaven, Jesus never would have needed to come. He certainly wouldn't have had to die. And so Christmas warns us, you're not making it on your own. I'm coming to help you. And Easter confronts us. This is what it takes to save you, to get you to heaven. And yet so many of us think that we do earn our way to heaven. That shows up in our proud attitude to other Christians, childlike Christians who don't know as much as we do, who aren't as committed as we are, whose lives aren't as tidy as ours. Or we see it in our attitude to our own sin. When we mess up or speak a harsh word or lie or worse, we proudly cover it up and hope no one will notice. Or we become defensive and try to justify ourselves. In these words, Jesus is confronting us, saying that life in his kingdom is not a reward for the strong. It's a gift for the weak. It's not for the healthy, but for the sick. Not for the righteous, but sinners. Verse 3 says, unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Trying to live a good and worthy life is not the way to heaven. It's the way to hell. The only way in is to fall at Jesus' feet. As the old hymn says, nothing in my hands I bring, simply to your cross I cling. It may be that you need to do that now, to change and become like a little child, to admit it to yourself and to God that you've been trying to earn your way to heaven. Instead, to open up your empty hands and receive his gift. All of us need to remember that. We need to make a habit out of confessing our sin, to remember that we are not worthy to be with Jesus, to be in his kingdom. But Jesus is saying that a good life is a humble life. Humble because it cannot earn salvation. And once we learn to confess our own weaknesses, then we'll also learn to be compassionate with the weaknesses of others. Look down in verse 5. Chapter 18, verse 5 says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung round their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Jesus is using the idea of stumbling or tripping over something to describe how our actions might trip up another Christian. And tripping sounds casual. Whoops! But what Jesus is describing is deathly serious. In verse 8 and 9, he says that stumbling is falling out of his kingdom and into hell, out of life and into death. And that's why this warning is so strong. The stakes could not be higher. So let me underline it. Jesus is saying that it would be better to be chained to the back of a car and pushed off a pier into the sea than to cause someone to stumble, to walk away from him. That's language we need to take very seriously. How might our actions then cause someone to stumble, to fall away from God? Or just think of how the disciples might have treated this little child standing in front of them. Their culture encouraged them to dismiss him, to push him away and focus on more important people. And yet that would have put a stumbling block in front of this child. It would have said to him, you can't come to Jesus like you are. First grow up a bit, do something useful with your life, and then you can come to Jesus. That requirement of adult competency is a stumbling block. It could cause this child to be discouraged and give up on Jesus altogether. And Jesus is thinking about more than little children. In verse 6, he makes it clear that this is about anyone who might believe in him. He will not tolerate stumbling blocks being put in their way. So think of people you've met who are repulsed by the church. Sometimes their problem is with God himself, with Jesus' own words, and we can't change that by ourselves. But there are some who've been driven away from the church by the behavior of Christians. Christians who proudly judged and criticized them, or manipulated their family, or twisted their arm for money. Jesus is warning us. Those who put stumbling blocks in the way of anyone, even the least, are in for the severest of judgments. It doesn't matter what our world says about these people. Weak, disabled, jobless, homeless, uneducated, poor. Jesus tells us that God has their back. Now, our church is planning to open a Christians Against Poverty debt center. And so we need to ask how we will treat the people that brings into our church. People with messy lives in the grip of debt or addiction. Will we put stumbling blocks in their way? Will we look over their shoulder for more important people to speak to? Will our shocked faces tell them, you'd better sort your life out before you come into this church? Will we invite them into our homes and families for meals? Jesus was at home with the lowlifes of his world, tax collectors and prostitutes. Are we? Or do we send them the message that heaven is for the middle class? Let me read Jesus' warning one more time. Verse 6, he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung round their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. One way to grow in our compassion for others is to see our own weaknesses. And so Jesus warns proud Christians, watch out. You're not as secure as you think. You could stumble too. Look at verse 8 and 9 with me. Verse 8, he says, if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. A proud attitude might trip others up, and it might trip itself up by underestimating the danger of sin. Here Jesus is describing sin like a body part, a hand or a foot or an eye. And he isn't saying that our sin actually comes from our hands or feet. Our problem is much deeper than that. But he is saying that removing that sin from our lives will be painful and costly, like losing a hand or foot. It will be painful, but not as painful as keeping it. Verse 8, he says, it's better to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or feet and be thrown into eternal fire and go to hell. So Christian, don't deceive yourself. You are not strong enough to live with sin, to make peace with it. So the pastor John Owen said, be killing sin or it will be killing you. You may have been a Christian your whole life, but that sin is stronger than you. You may feel like other things are more pressing in your life and that you can deal with the sin later. But that sin could send you to hell. You may feel like you're in a hard season and you deserve a bit of sinful pleasure. But that sin could destroy you. No Christian, no matter how mature, is strong enough to make peace with sin. Now, of course, there will always be some sin in our lives until Jesus returns. And so the Christian life will be an ongoing battle against sin. God doesn't expect us to somehow get rid of it all at once. He patiently works with us for the long haul. But in each season of life, he puts his finger on at least one sin, and he gives us the strength and the wisdom and support that we need to fight it. And that is where we need to act, even though it may feel painful, like gouging out our eye. A tapping on that app at the end of the day may feel like just the bit of comfort or distraction you need. But if it's stirring up jealousy or discontentment or lust, then it's time to cut it out. Or the bottle may promise you a bit of relaxation in a hectic life. But if it's stirring up sin and straining your relationships, then it's time to cut it out. We each know the sins that God is showing to us. We may not want to get rid of them, but we need to let Jesus, the good doctor, carve that cancer out of our lives. Listen again to verse 9. If your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away, because it's better for you to enter into life with one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. Humbling ourselves to do the hard work of fighting sin and to love others who are sinners is not an easy life. But God isn't asking us to do anything that he doesn't do himself. Read with me from verse 10. Verse 10 says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he's happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." It seems a bit odd that Jesus tells this story about a sheep and a shepherd, but the beginning and the end of his story make the purpose clear. Just look back at verse 10. He says, "See that you do not despise one of these little ones." And then the last verse, verse 14. "In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." The story is showing us how much God cares for the little ones. It's reinforcing what Jesus has been saying about childlike Christians, about caring for them. And he tells the story in verse 10 to encourage us to do the same, to not despise or overlook weak Christians, but to seek after them, to love them. Jesus in here describes God the Father as a shepherd who cares for each one of his sheep. He cares for them so much that when one gets lost, he goes out to look for it. Even if it's a skinny, scraggly, sickly sheep. Even if it's in the middle of the cold, dark, rainy night. And then he's more excited about finding that one than he was about keeping the 99 who didn't wander off. My family have an old nativity scene that we pull out every year about this time. And a few years ago, I was helping set it up, and the baby Jesus caught my eye. This is what he looks like. He's rough and chipped from years of being slung in and out of boxes, chewed on by babies and dogs, stuffed up into the loft. I was a bit sad at first, and then it hit me. This is what God chose. When the Almighty God chose to be born in Bethlehem, he knew he'd be roughed about, despised and rejected, nailed to a cross. And yet he did it for us. To find the lost sheep, to gather up his little children. That's the God we serve. Not a God who sits on his throne extolling his greatness, but the God who zips up his coat and lights his torch and goes out in the cold to find the lost sheep, the battered baby Jesus. So how should we react if someone wanders from the church? Do we throw up our hands? Nothing else we can do? Are we secretly glad they're gone? God never says that. He doesn't recline with the saved. He rescues the lost. That's what gets him excited. That's what impresses him. If you're watching this today and thinking about what life with Jesus might be like, hey, I know that this doesn't look like the most exciting way to live. But let me ask you this. What is that other life that's so much more exciting? What does that think about you? It may promise you fame and riches, it may promise the world, but what about when you lose your way? Will it come after you to find you? Or will it just replace you with the next person? Or what about when you fail? Will that life welcome you back with empty hands, with a father-like embrace? Or will it shame you for your failure? Maybe you've given church a try. You've been put off by the Christians you've met. It's okay that you're upset about that. God is too. But not all Christians are like that. More importantly, God is not like that. He goes out of his way to seek and to find you and welcome you just as you are. And that's the life that he calls us to lead. That is the worthy life. That's the good life, the greatest life. Confessing our sin, patiently loving other sinners, even those that wander. It's not the most impressive looking life. It won't have people eating out of the palm of your hand at Christmas parties. But it is the way to live, to eternal life, to the life of Jesus.